damage to buildings and infrastructures because we built in all the low-lying areas, and then all the human consequences follow from all the history in the communities where it's affected all the time. So that's me taking liberty of moderator and trying to synthesize for a minute. But I think the instructions we have is that for where we are in time, we should open it up now. So, so I think you can ask a question of the speakers or some other form. There's no rules that really about except getting respectful to each other. So yes, please. You can get an answer.
Valerie.
Great.
I don't understand all the science and stuff that you're talking about, because is there a possibility of another Sandy happening?
Well,
How soon?
The probability is increasing probably even more quickly. So it's, I think we probably underreacted before, maybe some to be overreacted in the months after, but I think the risks are very real. They're going to continue and they're not going to decrease.
Can I comment on that?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you. I want to suggest a slightly different way of looking at it. We shouldn't be thinking about Sandy. We should be thinking about what can actually happen. The science has gone a very long way in telling us how bad a storm can actually hit New York City. The regulations, the requirements on building on the waterfront do not require that level of preparedness. And I just want to make sure that that's a debate right now. We need to make sure that we make the right decisions, because I think the science has already told us how vast this could be. However, our requirements, our planning tools, etc., haven't gotten as far as I think they should.
I mean, would anybody in the panel disagree with the statement that all the resilience and adaptation measures in post-Sandy are not overreacting to the risk? It's not as though we're imagining, something, right?
I think it's a fantastic question, though, because it gets at what I think is actually the fears we all face. And I say this as someone who works in the field, right? Like, my greatest concern is that the work that we are doing is inadequate to warn communities. One of my other concerns is not just will another storm like Hurricane Sandy happen, and the low probability, high consequence events are really hard for the public sector to wrap its head around, because we have to make decisions about how we're spending our funding, and it's just hard to make that calculus work all the time when it's a low probability, high consequence event. But as what Camille said, with climate change, with sea level rise, it's going to get easier to get to that elevation of the floodwaters of Hurricane Sandy when the sea levels rise. So we know that in 30, 50, 80 years from now, even a smaller storm is going to cause that level of sea level of flooding because of sea level rise. All that said, my other great concern is that we've had now Hurricane Sandy, that was a surge event. We had just last year Hurricane Ida, that was a rainfall event. These keep on being the wake-up calls. Mm-hmm. What's going to be the next wake-up call for us? We have not had a phenomenon that we have seen already. Heat.
Can I also, and the heat is one, and I was going to mention heat because in Hunt's Point we have heat island effect, and we talk about heat as something that makes people extra vulnerable in our neighborhood. But I would say and our organization in our neighborhood doesn't need to fear and us to think about it too.
I think that's a good philosophy for all climate adaptation.
When you're ready, maybe we should take.
Yeah, maybe we should take more. Yes. Oh,
I live,
one and then two.
my name is Ann, and I live in Coney Island. So we also got hit terribly from Coney Island, okay, from Superstorm Sandy. But what I was going to mention is not just, first with Coney Island, we're basically, it used to be an island many years ago, but now we're a peninsula, so we're surrounded by water in three ways. And when Superstorm Sandy hit, the water levels literally attacked us from two sides. A little bit of the third, but we were almost inundated totally. One of our developments, Coney Island houses, they got hit the worst. Them and where the seniors are in Haber houses. Coney Island houses was built in 1954, as was Gravesend. Coney Island houses has a basement that's 3 floors below. So all that filled with water. Okay, and because we were so devastated, we even pushed city council to make their meeting in Coney Island, first in history, so that they could see it themselves, the damage we already had living, the conditions we lived before this, during this, and now after this. So Coney Island is also very, very much in the deep of it. And another community hit very hard was the Rockaways. Okay, now the Rockaways, I guess you guys would be able to explain it better, because even their water level is not the same as Coney Island or anywhere else. It's the only place in New York you could go and actually surf. That's how bad the waterways are, because they cross. But I'm also a member of Community Voices Heard. So and I went to the remembrance of Katrina in New Orleans for the 10th anniversary. So I've seen other areas that have been infected by these types of storms, and because these neighborhoods I'm referring to are predominantly Black and brown communities, we do get forgotten about. Now, once the storm hits, you have the city, the state, everybody's, oh, we're gonna fix it, we're gonna help, but what their thought is not necessarily to make our lives easier. Oh, we're gonna build this, and we're gonna build that, and we're gonna do this. It's not for us. Most of it doesn't include us. And this is why we as also NYCHA residents and low-income residents try to push forward and have these conversations with the people we live amongst to get them to understand just how much the seriousness is there. And, people think that it's no big deal. Like you said before, we had Irene. When Irene happened, it was the first time in my lifetime that I ever knew, and I'm 56 years old, first time I ever saw the city start to focus on our evacuation. So we evacuated. It didn't come the way they expected it. It moved a little. So, and at the same time, we also had earthquake, which we never had before, and tornado all around the same time. So these are things that are happening, and this is something that everyone has to understand. It doesn't, like you said before, it doesn't have to be a water damage. It could be the heat. It could be the electricity, the earth moving, all these different things. But we not only have to get on top of our elected officials and those responsible for doing the engineers and things like that, we have to start having conversations with them as well as ourselves, and know that we need to take an active part in prevention as well. So the most important thing everyone can do to start this rebuilding and helping Mother Earth is go outside and plant something. Okay, because when you plant something, you're giving the oxygen and more health back to your communities. So we can plant something until they're ready to figure out the plan on how to make the change. Thank you.
Well, there was
Yeah, okay, please, sir.
Yeah, number one, can you talk about the role of the federal government in residency? And number two, how has the insurance market changed? In the West Coast and the South, insurance markets have gone bananas because of fire and climate change. What about in New York?
Great set of questions. So, let me answer the insurance question first, and I'll try to explain the role of the federal government in that. So, throughout the United States, we have the National Flood Insurance Program, the NFIP. With that was originally created when the private market started backing out of flood insurance, of providing flood insurance, starting in the 1960s. In part because of these low probability, high consequence events that the flood insurance companies that were on the private market at the time were getting wiped out. That these hurricanes would happen, there wasn't enough money coming in on the annual premiums, And so, and they were having massive payouts. And so when the private market started to retreat, the federal government decided that they would step in and provide a national program. And the thought was that if enough people nationally are paying into this, and that these events are happening only a couple of times a year in the country, that there would be enough money going into the program to keep that going. That also had the either intended or unintended consequence of subsidizing development in the floodplain. That it allows people to build in the floodplain and to have much cheaper insurance rates than the actual risk would suggest. But it's been a program now for close to 40 years, roughly. And so the consequence of this has been that throughout the United States and here in New York City, communities rely on the National Flood Insurance Program. That it's that backstop. What we're seeing in other parts of the country with the similar retreat of the private market, not on flood insurance because there's this federal program, but on other forms of home insurance because of other risks from natural phenomena, so wildfires, et cetera. And so we're facing kind of a similar moment to that we faced on flood risk many years ago. In New York, we have not seen the insurance companies leaving the market just yet. Hopefully they wouldn't, but I mean, there are regulations at the state and federal level that go into this as well.
Sorry to interrupt, but in 3 minutes, we need 2 people from this room to join us for the report back. And everybody else can shop around and look at the other things on offer.
Catherine wants to respond on that point.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful to let people know how many times the National Flood Insurance Programs have had to be bailed out, and it's been in debt, and who knows how long it will be around.
That's great. That's actually a great point. Actually, I don't even remember the numbers offhand, Catherine, if you know them.
Well, one round was $27 million.
Yeah, I mean, it's to the tens of billions of dollars every couple of years that the federal government has to bail out the National Flood Insurance Programs.
Which means that they have to put money into it.
Yes.
Keep it alive.
Yeah, correct.
It means the flood insurance is too cheap to support the payout it has to pay.
One of the further complications is that every couple of years, Congress tries to revamp the program to bring it up to actuarial-based rates, which is the expected rates based on the likelihood of storms. Every time there's pushback from almost every congressional representative because people don't want to have to pay more insurance. It's a perverse system.
Can you explain what happens if the government doesn't bail the program out?
So great question. If nationally, if Congress weren't to be bailing out the system and the National Flood Insurance Program were to go belly up, homeowners would be then responsible for taking on that risk. Which is actually, we don't want to see that, right? We do not want to see the roughly 400,000 residents, 70,000 buildings that are in today's FEMA-defined flood zone to be paying that much more or to be taking on that individual risk. Because so for instance, after Hurricane Sandy, the National Flood Insurance Program provided a lot of funding, necessary funding, for those homeowners and for those property owners.
And not everybody, whether you're a small business or a homeowner, was adequately or maybe even compensated.
Yeah.
And there was major disruption of life and continuity.
Yeah.
And how do you put a price on that?
I would say one thing about and I could chat all day about the National Flood Insurance Program. But one of the things is that it really doesn't work well in New York City. The max payouts don't equate to the amount of money that construction costs in New York. This is a national program, so it's very much geared on a model of the single-family detached home. And when flooding occurs, it's your max payout, I think right now is $300,000. $300,000 in a New York City building doesn't get you rebuilt. It barely pays for your foundation. So I think that's one of the challenges of having a national program. But at the same time, there's a serious tension about how to either reform, totally rebuild that program, because it provides something that is absolutely necessary, but doesn't provide it well.
Would you agree it also doesn't reflect the latest science?
So it does only in a certain extent. So the National Flood Insurance Program is based on the likelihood of a flood occurring in an individual year. And so to that regard, if you're doing it, if your policy is for only 1 year, I would say it does reflect the current risk. The challenge is that the flood insurance, what we build is also in accordance to those standards. Although in New York City, we've ramped it up much higher than that. But nationally, I'll say, you just have to build to the standards of the National Flood Insurance Program. That in and of itself does not build in the future risk. It only looks at it on an annualized basis.
My understanding is that the current flood maps don't really have climate change scenario, though.
Well,
So in that sense, one could argue even the
The
1 year
regulatory,
risk,
yeah.
even the 1 year risk is not quite up to date.
Well, but the 1 year risk, so if you're starting a policy today, it's looking at today's flood risk. So,
Right, but if that's assessed with data going back 50 or 100 years,
well,
which I think is
the sea level.
Yeah.
To get the sea level right, but you're right, if storms are changing. then
If storms are
after
right.
that.
anyway, that's technicality.
So, Michael, doesn't some of the city self-insure their assets as well?
yes. And this is where things get, yes.
City and state, I mean.
I just want
yeah.
everybody in this room to be aware of the consequences.
Yeah, right. So, there's no National Flood Insurance Program coverage for the MTA or for DEP's wastewater. And there are also a decent number of private residents who take on their own insurance, separate insurance, small private market.
So I think we're out of time. Our organizers are cutting us off, and our reporters have to do the report back. So it was short, but thank you for your presence and participation.